Hello, SOCA 1010 students, and welcome to week 10 of the course. Last 2 weeks, you learned about 2 other social categories that can be the basis for discrimination and marginalization, which were class and gender. And this week, we're going to talk about race and racism, and we focus on these 2 concepts. So the lecture today will be, it's an brief outline of the lecture today. And you can see the lecture will be split into 4 parts. The first part, we're going to talk about race and racism. The second part, we discuss theories of ethnicity. And part 3, you are going to be introduced to 2 concepts and theories of intersectionality and hybridity. And part 4, we're going to talk about refugees and asylum seeker and the phenomenon of Islamophobia. So let's start part 1, understanding race and racism. So race is one of the heavy discussed concepts in social science, especially sociology. Race raises some complex questions in contemporary sociology. The idea of race is closely linked with the notion of white or European superiority. And historically, race was invented by a European in the context of European colonization, slavery, and genocide, and forms the basis for racial thinking today. Any theory of race and racism must take into account this brutal history of colonization and its link with racism. Therefore, race is a modern concept and it's a product of colonial encounters. Among social scientists, race is generally understood as a social construct. By social construct, we mean the concepts that is created by social interactions. Race refers to physically differences between a group of people. It's like a physiological difference, such as skin color, facial feature, hair textures, and this kind of difference. Race also includes some socially constructed belief that the human race can be divided into biological, discrete, and exclusive groups based on their physical and cultural traits. So there are different groups in society based on these differences. And race are distinguished by common physical characteristics, which are thought to be fixed. So there's assumption that race is a fixed concept. So why sociologists are interested in race? There have been arguments around the scientific basis of race, whether it's as association with group difference, ability, behavior, or it's got biological source. However, this debate is not central to sociologists, and they are not interested on this, what's the base of the race. But what sociologists are interested in is how ideas and perceptions and view of race can shape social behaviors, or what we call the social construction of race. So the social behavior that resulted from the view about the race is important for sociologists. Another point is the role of power in definition of races. Racism is very important. It means not everyone who is prejudiced has the power to discriminate. For example, if a friend, colleague or family member made racist jokes, it cannot discriminate in, for example, for that person to discriminate her or him, for example, to access some social opportunity like the access to education or work. But if it's someone in the power, for example, a politician make this kind of a racist behavior and racist belief, so it's embedded in practices and policy, and definitely can affect people's access to social opportunities like education, for example, or health, or even workplaces. So it's important to be mindful who make this, conduct this kind of a racism. So we know that whether we define race as real or not, we know that the racism is real and it's happening everywhere, and especially we're talking here in Australia. Racism as a result of social ideas about the race may not be scientifically valid, may not be any scientific base for race, but racism certainly is valid concept. And it occurs when mainstream people or societal structures systemically discriminate against persons on the basis of moral judgment about race that are based on their perceived physical characteristic, and which follows over into ideas about what kind of people they are. So it can people judge other people, other racial group, or just view them in different way. An example of racism to be denial of service on the basis of race. And a great example is indigenous people that have been excluded from many institutions, like they've been excluded from education, or definitely no political representation, or even accessing health. And also even until recently, they've been not allowed to attend some social events or even attend the bar and pubs. So it's a great example of exclusion of some racial group from some services. We need to be mindful that history of colonization shaped the politics of immigration and diversity in global north, where settler colonies like Australia have a historic relation to colonizing power, and the occurrence of racism, especially towards indigenous communities, an ongoing concern in Australia. Is not something that happens in the past, still it's happening. So in some countries like Australia, Canada, and US, they've got massive immigration and they've got a multicultural, some recent multicultural immigration policy. They have more and more getting more ethnically diverse. So racism taking a particular form in this country like Australia based on the diverse population. And despite the history of racism and racist colonial policy, such as white Australian policy that was overturned in 1973, a denial of racism still dominates in Australian public and popular discourse on race relations, and they are usually very subtle. Specifically, politicians use a number of tactics to deny accusation of racism. They just try to avoid total avoidance, or they don't want to use the word or term racism, or just try to divert attention to other social problems like poverty and unemployment. So they just a complete denial of racism that's happening and ongoing. There's a discussion about, as mentioned, base of the races, the base of the race. So there's a kind of a, based on that base, we got the two different kind of racism. It's biological racism and cultural racism. And historically, through 19th and 20th century, racism was justified based on scientific terms. It was the foundation of eugenics, that it's a term used that human can be identified as fit or unfit socially and biologically. So it's a justification to just destroy humans based on this. So it was the good example. It was a Holocaust. So race was considered as biological or national categorization. And as Western colonization and slavery expanded, the concept was gradually used to justify and prescribe exploitation, domination, and violence against people racialized as non-white people. So again, the good example is colonial violence toward indigenous community. It's the same in the racism toward African American in the US and also indigenous community in Canada. Cultural racism, also sometimes we call it new racism, is focused on culture instead of biology, and they believe that they want to maintain cultural identity of the host nation, and the culture of host nation is under threat by other cultures, but minority cultures. Like example is, for example, vilification of Muslims or Asians or different group. For example, there is an assumption that Muslim culture or beliefs is going to just be a threat to white Australian culture, or Asian culture is a threat. So it's the main concern here is more emphasized on the culture rather than biology. So another definition and another kind of racism is individual racism versus institutional racism or structural racism. Individual racism refers to an individual's racist assumptions, beliefs, or behaviors, as is a form of racial discrimination that stems from conscious and unconscious personal prejudice. So it can be, we may be aware of that racist behavior, but sometimes we are not aware and we are unconscious. It's unconscious bias and judgment that we have. However, there is another discussion that individual racism is not just completely separate from broader socioeconomic histories and contexts, and is always individual racism supported or reinforced by systemic racism or structural racism. Those they have a close link to each other. Structural racism or institutional racism, first defined by Stokey and Hamilton, it refers to particular and general instances of racial discrimination, inequality, exploitation, and domination in organizational or institutional contexts, such as the labor market or the nation state. So, as I mentioned before, like institutional racism can be, for example, denial of access or exclusion from education system, political representation, or access to work or workplace. So these kind of institutional racism. And it's a belief that institutional racism is usually can be overt, but most of the time is covert and very subtle. So unpacking structural racism is a bit challenging. It's a bit complex. Benolia Silva has also emphasized how political, economic, and social arrangements are structured by racial hierarchy and supported by colorblind ideology. So by colorblind ideology, it's the ideology that denies any racial categorization and believes there is a race does not matter anymore in contemporary society. And it's a simplistic belief: if we deny any racial categorization, the racism never happens. So this kind of new racism, or we can call it cultural racism or structural racism, as I talk, it's symbolic, it's covert, it's colorblind, and also there is a view that there is no blatant racism, and most of the racism we witness in the society are covert or they are less visible. So it's a belief that, and it's true to some extent, that you can't see someone, for example, employer go to the employee and say, because of your skin color, I'm not going to employ you. But it's very subtle based on the, for example, practices or policies that is embedded in that system or that organization. It can cause racism, it can lead to racism toward that person. It's more subtle. Also, there is a belief that it can be socially acceptable to have this kind of a racism, and it's also justifiable. Some people said, oh, look, everybody has these biases. So, for example, even people of color have those biases. And also because people may not be aware, or I'm not aware of this racist behavior that I just did toward other person, so they try to justify. Doesn't matter if it's conscious or unconscious. There is, we know that as I talk about the structural racism that's embedded in the society, and the children from the young age, they are exposed to all of those racist behavior and beliefs and values. In 1940s, psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark, they designed and conducted a series of experiments known as the Doltest to study the psychological effect of segregation of African American children. And these experiments have been recreated following the end of segregation, and they have similar finding. And you can see, you can now pause the lecture and watch this video. And what is in this video is just show from the young age how children, white and black, they both attribute kindness and niceness, being good, and to skin color. Like the white doll is good, and they all attribute the bad or naughty doll is the dark skin or black doll. So you can see how it's influenced from the early age on children's behavior and beliefs. And the last one that I want to talk in this part is about racism and media. As we talked in the last lectures, media can have a crucial role in empowerment of people, and it can be an agent of social activism, and it can have a positive role in society, and which can unite people. But unfortunately, despite this role that they can have in terms of racism, they always repeatedly reinforce racism, and they never challenge political discourse of racism in Australia. And we can see in the media, we rarely can see especially in the common platform, media platform, we rarely can see that the minority group are the center of news or any other media. And if they are talking, if the media is talking about the minority group, it's always try to vilify them and just portray them as threatening Anglo mainstream cultures. And a good example of that was the out of control African Australian gang in 2018 in Melbourne, that a group of some African young, they start doing some criminal act, and then it just went to the media and it just exaggerated and just generalized the whole community that is African gang and in particular Sudanese gang, and it caused lots of panic and moral panic in the media. And you can see in the picture that the then Prime Minister Turnbull was even talking that there is a real concern about Sudanese gang in Melbourne, that if the leader of a country just try to promote this kind of moral panic, there's no expectation that it doesn't happen with other politicians and other people. And again, the next one is African gangs' reign of fear, and just try to promote that fear. And these kind of headlines try to hyper-criminalize African youth in Australia and to cause moral panic. And instead of uniting people, it just try to divide people and just weaken the social cohesion of the community. And the last picture that I really find it interesting is just if we can see any act of violence or any, for example, crime or shooting that happens, if the person is a white person, is European, American, Canadian, or Australian, it always be just justified that that person is mentally disturbed. There's some mental health problem. It's that individual problem and has nothing to do with the whole group or the whole race. But if the same act happens by the person of color, a Black person, you know, an Asian person or a Muslim person, is going to be just known as a terrorist act, and the media is going to talk about it for months and months about it and exaggerate it and create moral panic. And as the result, is going to have lots of discrimination and harassing and marginalization of the whole community as the result of that person act. So we can see many examples of this that happened in Australia, and for months that community was a target of abuse and harassment. And the same thing even if it happened in other European country or America, again here we can see that community is going to be abused and harassed for a long time. So there are many examples of this kind of racism in media that you can see. And if you have a look at the media, you can see many examples of this. Okay, that's the end of part 1, and soon we're going to talk about part 2.